Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to CSIS. I'm Will Todman, the Deputy Director and a Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program here, and I am really delighted to welcome you to a discussion about environmental politics and civil society in the Middle East and North Africa. And I am joined by three wonderful colleagues with a real wealth of expertise on this topic. So firstly, joining me is Amy Hawthorne. She is an independent consultant on the Middle East with expertise on democracy and reform in the region. And she was previously the Deputy Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy and has held positions with a number of think tanks and also served in the US State Department during and in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Next, we have Hajar Khamlichi, who is a sustainability expert and a climate activist and advocate from Morocco. She is joining us from Baku, Azerbaijan, where she is for the COP Climate Conference. And she has been involved in and founded a number of environmental initiatives in the region, including serving as the co-founder of the Mediterranean Youth Climate Network, the Amal Initiative for Climate and Development, and she's also the co-founder of the Tangier Observatory for the Protection of the Environment. And then joining me here in the studio is Aly Rahim, who is the program manager of the Global Partnership for Social Accountability and also the global lead for citizen engagement at the World Bank. He was previously an assistant to the president of the World Bank, where his portfolio included civil society and stakeholder engagement. And the discussion today marks the release of my new report, which actually was released yesterday, Mobilizing for Sustainability, Environmental Civil Society in the Middle East and North Africa. And in this report, I sought to understand the degree to which civil society can drive environmental action in different parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And I chose a range of case studies. I looked at Iraq, Oman, and Tunisia, and my colleague and co-author, Marti Pimentel, looked at Morocco. And we wanted to understand how and in what ways civil society can contribute to efforts to tackle some of the environmental and climate crises which are facing the region today. To those of you watching online, you can submit questions either using the button on our website or on YouTube. So please do that, and I will raise them for the panelists later on. But firstly, Hajar, if I can turn to you, I'd love it if you could help us set the scene. What are the greatest challenges, the greatest environmental challenges that civil society actors in the region are trying to tackle today? Why is this topic important?
Thank you, Will. Well, the MENA region is facing a wide array of environmental challenges. That's really they get intensified by climate change and gives a lot of wave of action to civil society. We can cite on the water scarcity primarily, which is the big issue. So the region is one of the most stressed water stressed areas globally. There is a factor of rapid population growth, inefficient agricultural practices, and climate change that is worsening really the case with a lot of water shortages. So this all affects, of course, the health, human security, and impacts the economy as well. Countries like Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, or Yemen are particularly most vulnerable, and as the strain on water resources has far-reaching implications on all the regional stability in the MENA. Desertification and land degradation. This is another hot topic which is really, really relevant for the region. It's caused by the expansion of the desert lands, overgrazing, and unsustainable farming practices, and it is reducing meaningfully the Arab lands across the region. So this loss impacts food security, rural livelihoods, and economic resilience. As nations now rely heavily on agricultural productivity to sustain the local population and the whole economy. We have the air pollution. There is a rapid urbanization in the region, and there is the fossil fuel dependency is growing very much with the growing industrial activity. It's making air pollution, a serious public health issues, particularly in major cities like Cairo, Tehran, or Riyadh, and so many others. The marine and coastal degradation, this is the third one, and the countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Tunisia are facing significant threat from overfishing and loss of marine biodiversity. So this degradation is really harmful and critical to the economies that rely partly to these resources as well. The waste management is one of the preferred topics for civil society, because the implication and the impact is very notable and visible, and everyone lives it in their daily life. There is poor waste management practices across the region, and the pollution is impacting the rural and the urban alike. So inadequate disposal and recycling system contribute to the contamination of soil and water, and all the health and risk that poses to the populations. The deforestation is one maybe that doesn't occur much to the wide audience, but it is really an issue in the region. Much of the MENA region is arid, and even though deforestation remains very significant, mainly for Morocco, Lebanon, and Algeria, where unsustainable really logging with agricultural expansion, but one of the most threats is the urban development. This leads to soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and also the well-being spaces for the communities. Plus, of course, it lowers the capacity to carbon sequestration. What I can add, it's not last but not least at all, is the energy transition and emission reduction. While they are not on the same level of production and consumption, so there is so many difference between the countries. Some of them are producing some of the fossil fuels, and some of them are heavily relying on exports, but still really transitioning to clean energy is a big challenge. While the civil society would love to tackle, but they are not very much equipped yet in this sense. So the combined effects of these challenges really highlights the urgent need for sustainable policies and practices across all the region, because it also requires comprehensive strategies and integrated environmental, economic, and social dimensions to foster the resilience for the long term.
Absolutely. That's a daunting list of challenges that you've just laid out for us. And you mentioned a couple of times areas that civil society actors are more involved in. I think you said waste management in particular. Can you give us a bit of optimism? What are some of the most promising initiatives that you've seen different civil society actors working on in the region?
Yes, the most actively they are working on project management, on water projects. So the water resources management project is top one. Given the situation, civil society and they started by raising awareness. This is like the basis where all the civil society in the region started working on. Then they progressed to do more advocacy, and now they passed to implementing innovative projects to manage and conserve the water resources. In Morocco, we have the Observatory for the Protection of the Environment and Historical Monuments, who has really spearheaded community-driven projects that involved rainwater harvesting and water-saving practices, plus a range of policy advocacy programs at local level. In Jordan, particularly, and Palestine, they are one of the most this is one of the biggest area that is tackled by NGO, and they are exploring greywater recycling and other water-saving technologies. So these projects underscore the critical role that the civil society is playing in managing this scarcity of resources. The waste management was one of the main themes in Morocco and Tunisia. They have been very active. Mainly the grassroots organizations. So they have been raising awareness and campaigning to collect the waste. But they pass it towards negotiations and advocacy with the local municipalities, and it wasn't something very easy because the challenge of the policies, the national policies, that wasn't going at the same speed as that advocacy and the needs of civil society, and there is this imbalance. Like in Morocco, there is a significant advance in this sense, in this area, but maybe sometimes in Jordan as well, but much less in the other countries. The renewable energy advocacy and implementation, let me say, it is a big issue. It is a big subject, but the way it is tackled is different. And let me say and give the credit to the Tunisian grassroots organizations who were like the first and the most effective in this sense. Mainly those on the south of Tunisia, the areas where the fossil fuels reserves are placed there. So they started very strong campaigns and then moved to advocacy and policy at more than national levels, then in Egypt and in Morocco as well. Jordan, it was already a big policy from the country since the beginning to have those coverage of PV, photovoltaic solar rooftops, but the civil society continues on more how to relate the nexus with water and energy nexuses more than the main energy thing. In Morocco, they are now starting bigger. They started like advocating to have better policies, to have a more, let's have say explicit, but it's more specific regulations for renewable energy spread headed. But now what is nice is that they are starting to have this multi-level approach, which is very interesting. It's like harnessing 10 years or 15 years of working in energy transition that doesn't work, and climate which is not taking us to nowhere. So now they split themselves and organize into networks. And we have a group who's working at the local level, and group who's working at subnational, and group who's working with the national levels, advocacies and campaigning. And they are trying to complement their work and their efforts. And this is really a good step ahead of Absolutely. What was happening.
And thank you so much. And I do want to come back to that point later on about the level at which, we can hope that civil society groups can have most impact. It's perhaps helpful to clarify who we're talking about as well at this stage. When we talk about civil society, it's a really diverse community from formal NGOs, informal activists and volunteers. We've got journalists who are working to raise environmental awareness, entrepreneurs who are trying to come up with new green solutions, even artists who are trying to sort of get involved in that in the efforts to spread environmental awareness. Ali, if I can come to you next, Hajar has mentioned, I think, quite how active civil society is in a variety of areas, and she talked about project management as being one of the most successful ways in which civil society are focusing their efforts today. How can international actors best amplify some of these local initiatives? Thinking about your perspective from working in the World Bank, how do you think about getting involved in supporting this kind of work?
Well, thanks, Will, for having me here. And I think, your report is quite timely with, the eve of COP in Baku. And also, these serious discussions have been happening over the last year plus about the renewal of the international financial architecture and, reaching our goals for climate finance in the developing world, the $100 billion pledge that's, famous from Paris. Which I remember being involved in when that number was being developed, and what that promise means and who are we delivering through. So a lot of the thinking about the renewal of the international public financial architecture has been about how we one, catalyze larger flows of public dollars, but two, governments, and how we leverage those scarce funds, whether they're concessional funds, whether they're grant monies, whether there are, other kinds of financing instruments, but to catalyze larger amounts of private capital flow. And of course, bilateral donors, philanthropies, and others who support the civil society ecosystems are thinking about this. But we're not yet strategically leveraging the idea of what civil society brings to these large global challenges. And I think there's a rethink underway. I think your report is another salvo in that. And we've been thinking seriously about this the last 2 years. The Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which I led, quite appropriately emerged in the wake of the Arab Spring. The president of the World Bank at the time, Bob Zoellick, seeing what was happening in the Middle East, said, we can't just work through governments and the private sector alone to reach our development goals. We need to build an architecture to engage civil society. And I think we've done good things in this platform, but it didn't scale. And often it doesn't scale. And I think that the challenge as we look forward to the future is how do we take this rich ecosystem of work, which you describe in your report, which Hajar is getting to in her comments, and actually link it to the large-scale finance. I think this is where we fail to integrate, that we have this fragmented development ecosystem. How we think of development in the multilateral space is very different how philanthropies are thinking about development when they're supporting CSOs, for example. We need to thread together this architecture, and I think climate and environment is the crucible that might finally force us to get there, not because it's strategically beneficial to engage civil society, because it's strategically necessary to engage civil society. And I think that's the pivot we need to make. And I'll get later in my comments into sort of the architecture and what we're thinking about. But to get to the nuts and bolts of this, it's if we're seeing, and I like how you're talking about the spectrum of civil society. I like to use the word social economy, social sector actors. We're calling the new facility we're launching CIVIC, the Civil Society and Social Innovation Alliance, because I think we think of a spectrum of actors from your traditional CBOs, CSOs, NGOs, service delivery, advocacy organizations, through to what might be B Corps, social enterprises, impact-based businesses. There's a real spectrum of actors that exist between the public and private space that we need to bring in. And there are scalable solutions. And number one thing I hear often is this is cute, this is nice, but it isn't scalable. And I think that's a false narrative. I think we have a lot of scalable solutions, and what you start to get at here, working through coalitions, working through networks, building a global civic architecture. This is something that a friend and colleague, the CEO of Counterpart International, and Hajar recently called, we need to build a global civic architecture. How are we linking the local to the global? The localization agenda, the decolonization of aid. We see all these things out there, but what does it really mean in the context of this big international financial architecture reform? And what's the role of civil society in the big bets, in the big picture? And how do we start to connect these dots? I think these are the big questions we really need to start answering today. And I mean, the Middle East is a great case, but there's many others, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa. Similar patterns are playing out globally right now. And it is a moment to really think about how we build this new architecture.
Thank you. And Amy, if I can turn to you, a lot of the support for civil society comes from donor governments in the region, and many of the initiatives that I found to some degree or another relied on government or international government support. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you think donor governments should think about the potential of civil society, both in the environmental sphere and more broadly, and what are they getting right and wrong in terms of the support that they're providing?
Thank you, Will, and thank you so much to CSIS, for inviting us here today. And I want to congratulate you and your co-author on this incredible report, which is, I think, really, really path-breaking. There are a couple of big things, in my view, that donors are today getting right about support for civil society. The first is just a recognition that civil society is a legitimate and a necessary actor and partner for donors. And this might sound like an obvious point, but as recently as, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, this wasn't necessarily the case. So I think it really does represent progress, significant progress that I've seen over the course of my career tracking this issue closely in the MENA region. The sort of mainstreaming and legitimation of the concept of civil society as a really crucial development partner. The idea that supporting governments, supporting states, supporting national institutions is simply not enough, and that there's this whole other space out there that both Hajar and Aly talked about that is so rich and diverse and crucial. So that's a really big thing that donors are getting right, and we shouldn't take that for granted. It's taken many years to get us to that point. Second thing that I believe donors are getting right in the main is that there are aspects of the localization agenda that I believe really benefit civil society in the region, or have the potential to really benefit and strengthen civil society in the region. And just the whole concept of localization is something very, very important, I believe, if we're talking about strengthening civil society and creating a sustainable civil society sphere in all of these countries. There are, however, also some very big things that I think donors have really gotten wrong in the main when it comes to civil society support. And the first one is, to be a bit blunt about it, is just an utter failure on the part of donors to really play any significant productive role in countering and pushing back against the closing civic space that this region has been experiencing, particularly over the past 10 or 15 years. For those of our viewers and audience today who are younger, it may seem hard to believe that 10, 15 years ago, there was actually more space for civil society in most countries in this region. The space is so limited today, but in fact, there was a little bit more room in some countries for civil society activism, advocacy, engagement, etc. And we've seen, one of the major trends that has happened in this region since the 2011 Arab uprisings is a concerted effort by regional governments to close space for civic actors and to increase the penalties and punishments for activism and for receiving unauthorized donor funds, and for countering the regime's narratives, etc. So this has been an overarching trend, and all donors, in my view, whether it is the multilateral institutions, whether it is the EU, whether it is the United States, whether it is the Japanese government, etc., have all in their way really failed to use their leverage and influence to push back against governments in the region who are trying to suppress and control and weaken civil society. And so what we see is two sort of conflicting big trends. The first one, as I mentioned, is a real much more, a deeper acceptance and legitimation on the part of donors of the role of civil society. But that is happening in a context in which the space for civil society across the board in this region has become more and more and more constrained and controlled. So that, I think, is probably my overarching assessment of what donors are getting right and wrong in the main when it comes to civil society support, across all sectors of activity, not simply on environmental activism.
Absolutely. And part of the reason that I chose the countries I did was to try to get a range of some of these different political environments. And some of them, I think Tunisia probably, unfortunately, is the main case of this, really are experiencing a closing of that space and a narrowing of that space in which civil society actors can have impact. And if we go back, it was Tunisian civil society actors that won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on the quartet, on the transition to democracy. And so the really, part of that chapter looks at how to navigate this new space. So Aly, if I can come back to you, bearing in mind all of the challenges that we've been talking about, what does success look like for civil society in engaging in international development projects or trying to drive environmental action? What sort of metrics should we be looking for to know if they are having a really positive impact or not?
So I think, the point made, and I think one of the challenges is the projectization of the space and the fragmentation. And I think Hajar was getting to this a little bit. I think that's very good. And civil society organizations, there's also a trend that is linked to closing civic space, and that's a diminishment of funding and also a fragmentation of funding. So it's very hard for a lot of CSOs to access funding, and who they access funding from actually plays to the civic space issue. So when funding is nested, let's say, in the World Bank, it's very different for a government to say, we're gonna shut that tap off. That's part and parcel. It's linked to a World Bank project, has a status of international treaty. There's very different parameters of clawing back funding. Whereas if you're getting a grant from OSF, depending on how the Open Society Foundation or one of their networks, there's a different perception. And all of these actors are important, but what we lack, I think, is a systematic funding source. So that's also why we at times lack systematic metrics. The metrics are often very project bound, they're very time bound. And what you talk about here, and I think the metrics go to your sustainability principles. What is making this politically sustainable, socially sustainable? How are we building new systems? How are we building new capacities within government to engage with civil society? So the supply side matters, and then the demand side. How are we realizing network effects? This also goes to civil society side. You see increasing coalitions, you see increasing networks, you see Southern-based intermediary organizations that can support smaller organizations, because not every small CSO should develop the capacity to access USAID funding. That's the transaction costs of that aren't good, but that's almost what our current system requires. Maintain an M&E framework that aligns with what a bilateral donor or a major international philanthropy monitors. You're wasting that CSO's capacity and energy, which should be directed to its strengths. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't receive those monies. So that's why the civic architecture piece matters so much. I think projectization is a problem in development writ large, but it's especially a problem in scaling the strategic role of civil society. So I think while we see great work from civil society around the world, including in the Middle East, we're seeing a failure to scale a lot of these initiatives because, one, we lack that link to government, and a lot of the entities, the international actors role, which you said, can help be a brokerage, and that's sort of what we want to do more of at the World Bank. I think the IFIs and multilaterals are actually hugely under-leveraged tools, and at times in our history, we have been more leveraged for this, and when we do, it makes a big difference. The biggest time this probably happened was when I first joined the bank 20 years ago, when Jim Wolfenson became president of the World Bank. This was part and parcel, a core part of his bank's reforms were about how to bring participation, civil society actors, and NGOs into development. It was revolutionary at the time. And while we progress and sort of internalize that a lot in our DNA, but it's not the same as it was then, if I'm to be candid, because there was real vision and thinking about how we do this. So I think that's why I keep going back to the renewal of the international financial architecture. This is the big discussion about how we make development dollars more effective, how we connect the SDGs to climate and environment. And the civil society narrative is not well articulated enough. And I think we need a local to global discussion about what this piece means. And I think we really need to connect the philanthropic environment, the multilateral environment, the bilateral environment, the place where most of these monies will come from, and then increasingly in different countries. You see this in the Gulf states, for example. There's also a burgeoning domestic resource base for a lot of these initiatives, but it's certain countries where those are housed, and there's different dynamics. So how do we connect the funding ecosystem so then we can have more systemic metrics? I think that matters region by region, country by country, but also globally. And I think there needs to be a concerted effort around this.
And that's great. Actually, the questions are coming in already, so thank you to the audience for your questions. But one of those, actually from my colleague, Marty Pimentel, is exactly on this point, which is, could you expand on the differences between the ways that philanthropies and multilateral organizations support environmental action? And you said that we need this more synchronized approach. What are the barriers to that at the moment?
So the barriers, if I take the World Bank as a specific example, we are an institution designed for sovereign lending to governments, right? Our clients are described as governments. We have commitments to citizen engagement, participation, impact on beneficiaries, but we do see our clients as government. We lend our money to governments and to the private sector through our private sector arm. But we do recognize the role civil society plays. But our primary funding engineering is to channel money through governments. Philanthropies, do some support to government, but are generally supporting NGOs and nonprofits. Bilaterals have a mix of support. So they're very different funding ecosystem. But let's say, I heard the case of water. I heard the case of a solid waste management project. I heard, all these things. The largest public financing for those comes from the multilateral development institutions. And most of those projects won't have an explicit funding piece linked to civil society actors. Some of them will, and they're great examples around the world, from us, from the Asian Development Bank and others. But if we want these things to scale, if we want them to genuinely influence, and I think this is at the core of your report, which struck me so much when you reached out to me, is that we need to connect the nodes. And I think international actors need to thread together that connection with governments. When we do that, when bilateral actors are doing that, when multilateral actors are doing that, you, help create a space for this work to flourish. You create a safe umbrella. Let's say you're doing a large-scale energy transition project. How are you going to think about benefit sharing? How are you going to think about stakeholder consultations in a systematic way? How are you going to think about beneficiary feedback into project design? And we have these elements built into our design principles, even in the multilaterals, but we don't have effective vehicles to sort of bridge in those partnerships. So we're trying to build that more. And this is the idea behind Civic, our new successor. It's reflected in the IDA replenishment paper. It's been committed to, by our bank leadership. Ajay Banga announced this at our annual meetings last week. So our leadership is seeing the importance of this. We're going to have a new indicator in the bank's corporate scorecard. There's two parts. The bank, I don't know if people have been following this, but we want to show a more concerted effort around development results. So there's 20 outcomes of development we're going to drive, and there's 20 or so indicators in an organizational effectiveness dashboard, which will be public to the world on how we're effective in doing this. And one of those indicators is going to be on civic and citizen engagement. So this also will hold us to account on how we do better. But I think in the end of the day, more money has to be nested also in the multilateral system to support civil society. And many people have been pressing for that. And I think we need to see how these different actors come together. And then within the context of these projects, that it is just taken for granted that there is a piece that involves financing, partnership, delivery, oversight, that comes from civil society as key actors in the delivery of large-scale financing.
Thank you. And Hajar, earlier on, you started to talk about the different levels at which civil society actors are working, some at the really local level, some at the provincial or regional level, some at the national level, even some at the international level. And could you talk to us about what level you think civil society at this stage is best placed to have an impact at? Should we be focusing on one of those levels over another? Or do we need people to be working at all of those levels?
Let me before answering, going through giving my my comments on it, and I would like to thank Amy and Amy for bringing in all those interesting comments, because it triggers a lot of other thinking on me. I really agree with all what has been said. Just wanted to flag that 83% of the civil society engagement is voluntary based in the MENA region. So we have only 17%, and this 17%, it is counted the big foundations related to governments. So it is very, very tiny portion of the civil society that get to be funded to get to the professionalization of their work. So that will lead to the sustainability and retaining those capacities. The good capacities, they can deliver the right work and the right progress for the community. So yeah, this is very important, and the multi-year funding is detrimental in this sense. That either international cooperation or philanthropies are not yet there, and this is what makes the difference between the global north civil society and the global south and MENA civil society, is to get to be professional and to make it be one of their main roles or mission on the daily lives, because this, even we can notice the passion, we can notice the engagement, but it cannot harness all the experience for long-lasting periods. Coming back to the question, I will keep the three because they are detrimental, they are really crucial. Local level, civil society have short-term impacts that they can really tackle at the local level, because they are so close to build the ties with the municipalities and broader local stakeholder partners, starting from awareness building. They can address the specific environmental issues with the local authorities, private sector, and the wider urban or rural components. They are the best positioned to drive the behavioral change and to engage the communities in best practices and the changing to local policies. We can say it's slightly easier than going to subnational and national level and abroad. Now, subnational is very important because with subnational you get to engage more complex problematics, because we have this, it depends on the countries, the governance architecture of it, and which of the topics are governed at local and some of them at subnational. For example, we have in some countries that water is managed by subnational, solid waste is managed by local, and energy is managed by national, and so on. So each topic has different level of governance, and they need to be ready to tackle each one of them and to engage with the right stakeholders for them. National level is very important and is one of the most critical ones, because this is the main advocacy for policy regulations, for really monitoring and advancing the progress. It is true that this is becoming really being active as civil society at national levels became hard task due to some civil society spaces that shrinked, as Amy was mentioning. That's so true, but still they can find their way in a different modes. So they are really adapting with agility to start to find other ways to tackle. So and it's always important to bring them from the national level to the international sphere. Really taking those good, the right profiles, the good representatives to international networks, it helps drive the local to the global, and to make impact. We can notice very much that there is so few and rare civil society representative from the MENA region in international networks. Really rare. The rate, I cannot even cite a rate. So as much as we get a representative to there, they will have more impact. They will drive their vision, really deliver the need, the local need, and the national perspective. That is most of the time driven by Western perspective or global North civil society perspectives, because there is a line between sharing knowledge, building capacities, and delivering a new vision, how things need to be done, and respecting how the main needs, the local, the national context, the local needs, the cultures, the main challenges, and how people knows how civil society and communities know how to do things. They need to be much more guided on more structural, organizational, other type of capacity to enable them and make them feel more confident into driving their own path on their local levels. So yeah, the road from local to global is attainable, and we can see it. We can see these impacts, how they can drive, and we can see the challenge and the shocks that happens among this world. I was very happy to know, for example, lately we have one MENA organization that is following the World Bank meetings that was mentioned by Amir so far. And yeah, it is the only grassroots organization so far that reached that level to engage into those discussions. So they got to that understanding. This is awesome, thanks to philanthropic funding that stays and kept some professional capacities there. So yeah, I don't want to take a lot because I can speak about this heartfelt.
But actually, this is a perfect segue, because we just had a question come in from Shivan Anand at the Center for New American Security, who asks, and I think this is probably best for you, Hajar, how important is representation for smaller Middle Eastern states that have fewer resources on a global stage, such as at the COP conference? And can it actually yield scenario-specific solutions? So speaking to us as someone who's from Morocco, currently at COP, what are the sort of solutions that you're hoping to gain by being there at COP?
Well, first, I can say three, but the first thing that comes to my mind is bringing the voice of these communities to the scene, to the international scene. That's the first and very important one. It seems very basic, but it's not basic in reality. It's very crowded in terms of ideas, in terms of positions, in terms of ideals, in terms of the way we see the world and make solutions. So bringing those voices is imperative. We can say that we can notice some of the voices or the representative already there here trying to do this work. Secondly, defending the right to development in terms of the developing countries from the MENA region and those small countries need to develop and progress in a sustainable green world. The other thing is the loss and damage point. That is now is very, very hot topic, and not all even between developing countries there is not a right understanding. We are really diverging on who's deserving to be compensated and who's not deserving, and what is to be paid for, which of damages to be paid for. And yes, it's very complex. There is a wide array of subjects, and I cannot say solutions so far, but they are political and subject to be tackled. We are in our way to solutions if the international or multilateral sphere allows it, even though, because with all the solutions that are present so far, there is the main, we always facing the main challenge, which is finance. And there is that feeling that the money is there, but how to pin it down? That's the big question in COP and broader than COP. From where are we going to get that money to implement those renewable energy projects in North Africa, in Africa, on the MENA region? From where are we going to get this money to really enable new economies that's based on clean pathways, from where we are going to allow more access to education, more access to knowledge, more access to the spaces and development. So yes, these are very complex topics if you want to dig into one by one. But yes, it is how to get the money for adaptation and how to get the funding as well for the solutions for the projects. This is the main topic this year on COP, and everyone is passing around. And luckily, we are not seeing how you say the light on the tunnel yet in this.
Okay. Yeah. Amy, I wonder if you could help us think through some of the politics of this, because part of what I tried to explore in the report is the fact that, as you said, we're looking at a closing space for civic activity in a lot of these countries in the region. And you've spent a lot of time working in some really challenging political contexts. Can we really expect civil society to have impact in these places? And what kinds of groups have you seen that are best able to navigate the political constraints to civic association, advocacy, and whatnot?
Thanks, Will. Yes, we can expect civil society to have an impact in closed political spaces. Of course, I am constantly impressed and amazed and humbled by what colleagues are managing to achieve in countries in the Middle East and North Africa under really very, very daunting circumstances and with all kinds of challenges and pressures. Overall, I believe we do have to keep our expectations modest, because change and lasting change and major change is really, really, really difficult to achieve in any society, but especially in societies that don't have, basic rights and freedoms. And that are closed political environments. That just makes everything so much harder, from governance to activism to local development, etc. So when I look at sort of the sweep of the last 10 or 15 years, where I see civil society has made an impact, of course, I see many positive examples at the local level, and Hajar spoke about this a bit. So organizations, citizen-led organizations working in their communities to make things better, we actually do see positive examples. I also see sort of on the broader national level that, frankly, it is social movements, not civil society, or certainly not NGOs per se, that have achieved maybe the most impact. And social movements are really something that is much, much broader than civic organizations, and they tend to include many different types of associations, of groups, of leaders, and so they're very broad coalitions, and they often tend to have a conflictual approach. They are challenging governments, challenging regimes, and they also often take a mobilizational approach. So they have as a key part of their strategy, mobilization. And these are the kinds of movements and the kinds of tactics that make a lot of donors very uncomfortable. And so there isn't necessarily a strong record of support from donors for social movements. And indeed, in many cases in the region, it's my sense that social movements, as opposed to specific individual, kind of formalized NGOs, they don't necessarily want donor support. And donors aren't necessarily willing or able to find ways to support them. So there are examples of sort of bottom-up change, citizen-led change. But overall, I'm a bit sobered at this moment, because when I look at social movements on different issues in different countries in the region that have been citizen-led and pushing for positive change and pushing on issues that citizens really care about, oftentimes we see two things happening to really blunt the impact of those social movements, of which, of course, civil society and NGOs, are an important part, but they're not the leaders. They're part of a coalition. We see, number one, governments, regimes taking, very bold steps to crush and weaken these movements, to blunt their impact and to roll back what they're trying to achieve. And secondly, we see within the movements themselves and within the coalitions, fragmentation, conflict, division at a certain point happening that really weakens these coalitions. And that's something that's it's not unique to the MENA region. It happens in many, contexts across the world, that it's hard to keep, broad coalitions of different interest groups and different voices are really essential to achieve large-scale change. But the very nature of those diverse coalitions often makes it difficult for them to stay together for a long time. So I guess I have kind of modest and sober expectations about what civil society can achieve. And when we're talking specifically about the environmental arena, I think Hajar gave some really great examples of where there are local issues and local stakeholders and local decision makers. And those issue sets, when it comes to environmental activism, may offer more space and more promise for civil society success to achieve positive change. But when we think about certain aspects of the environmental crisis, the climate crisis that is facing this region, it's my view that it really is national governments and international actors that hold the most power and the most responsibility to implement policy change that will set in motion potential solutions to this crisis. And it has been very, very challenging for civil society to affect those national level policies.
You touched on so many points that I just have tried to wrestle with over the last year or so. Sort of how do civil society actors go from mobilizing in opposition to something to mobilizing for a better solution? And it's so difficult because then it requires bringing in the technical, but also continuing to mobilize with the advocacy side of it. And I visited some amazing initiatives in the region as part of this research, one of which has stuck with me, which is a group in Tunisia called Manish Msab, which means I am not a garbage dump. And this is a group that mobilized against a landfill that the government kept renewing beyond its intended lifespan. And they used art, they used street processions, and they really mobilized the community against this landfill and ultimately closed it. The challenge is that I visited them about a year after it had closed. They want to keep going and they want to build on this movement that they have created and nurtured, but they don't really know how. And I think maybe that's where there's some ability for international actors to come in and help connect with some of the environmental experts who might be able to put forward some of the solutions. But Aly, I really want to talk to you a bit about accountability, because a big focus on your work is ultimately on accountability, and in the climate space and the environment space. What role can civil society play in bolstering accountability, particularly in some more challenging environments where the political context isn't open?
No, I think it's a great question, and I'm loving this discussion because, and the interesting thing about these discussions is that, from your report or from what I'm hearing from my colleagues, is the problem diagnosis is quite widely known. The solutions are quite widely known. Any of us who have been working on this in any meaningful way, we have some points of difference, but the theory of change here is clear. So then it goes to how do we build out this architecture, right? And then a lot on political incentives. And I think this point you're making is that there's this critical Venn diagram, this contestation, this oppositional social change, which is a critical part of the evolution of societies and economies. That needs to happen. But we often lose sight of that convergent space. It's a convergent space that birthed the GPSA, for example, the Open Government Partnership. We've known about this space, but we vary from time to time in our attention, especially thinking of larger scale development and finance, about how much that matters. I think it's always mattered critically. And I think we're at one of those inflection points. Climate is the crucible that we're going to hopefully, and our political leadership, hopefully, there's a lot happening in the world, will start to recognize that we have to build out this common space. I mean, I remember reading the speech recently when Obama launched the Open Government Partnership and saying that the trust and integrity and participation are the only ways which we achieve this SDGs, which we achieve these goals. And this is before we were sort of at the upswing of the climate crisis. So 2 years ago, when I took this portfolio over, we had, we knew we were probably going to sunset the GPSA at that time. There wasn't necessarily even a discussion of whether this kind of work should continue at the World Bank. And we said, okay, let's really think about how we use our funds to sort of model where we want to go. And we could have taken your report and integrated it into the Green Accountability Concept Note. So we launched this Global Green Accountability Initiative and program. First principle was we need to do things at scale. We can't be a fragmented grant maker picking bets from Washington. Okay, we need to work through civil society networks. And we need, this point Hajar made is at the core of the idea, how do we make local to national connections? Then how do we make national to regional connections? And then how do we make regional to global connections? We borrowed Jonathan Fox's term at the Accountability Research Center about vertical integration, but we said we need a global vertical integration because you need those voices from those local actors ultimately percolating up to the climate negotiations at COP. And let's be frank, that is not happening at scale. And when it does happen, it is individual, well-presented actors who are picked from each region who can have a voice. There's not a systemic integration of voice. So how do you build that architecture out? Because it's not hard to do. We know how to do it. We need to finance it, we need to structure it, we need to scale it, we need to embed it in institutions like ours. So with the Green Accountability Platform, we chose to deliver through a consortium, a North-South consortium of civil society partners to be our on-granting partners and to set up a convening knowledge and financing platform. We're piloting this in 5 countries, Bangladesh, Mexico, Senegal, Brazil, and Cameroon. And so we chose a slate of countries that have quite significant climate challenges, but from different angles, and quite different civil society contexts. And in all those contexts, we're working further through networks to build this kind of participatory decision-making and fund those organizations. Over 24 organizations are going to be funded through this consortium. All that funding is started, and connecting them also, both at the national level, at the global level, to the World Bank financing, to governments. So how do we start to build out that convergent space? So that one example is an organization, a network of 50 organizations in Senegal that are going to work on the national plan for the preservation of mangroves. Think of that as a critical ecosystem that you need for climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, right? But to do that, you might have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on mangroves. The traditional way will fund a program through the government to preserve the mangroves. That's not going to work. Mangrove preservation requires very close activity at a local level. Is that work being done? Who's it being done by? Is it being monitored? Is it being overseen? And we have the organizations to do this work, but they're not funded, they're not capacitated, they don't have the digital solutions they need to track and monitor what they're doing. So it's about connecting ecosystems. There's a lot of connectivity work that needs to happen. And the last point I'll make is we need to build a better evidence case amongst us. The narrative stories are great, but we need to convince economists and policymakers that this matters. We need data. We need evidence, and we're actually working on that with our development economics research group, so we'll contribute to that dialogue soon. But that this participatory approach actually tangibly affects the outcomes we're trying to reach. We commissioned a report last year called Better Accountability, Better Finance with the consulting firm Systemic, which is one of the global leaders in blended finance and climate. And that extrapolated, what would it mean to have upstream transparency, participation, accountability integrated into climate finance and climate projects, and how will that affect outcomes? So, we need to put more things like that out there to show policymakers that this isn't just the normative, the social license work. It's critical. I'm a deep believer in it. But I think we need to start saying this goes to outcome pathways. There is no net zero pathway without this kind of work. And we've seen it before. If we have the kind of uptick in infrastructure investment and other investments into low governance environment without this kind of work, we know that story. We've known it for decades of development work. So why are we not more systematically integrating this thinking into the large-scale discussions of climate finance? It's a question we all need to ask ourselves. And we're starting. It's starting. We at the World Bank and others are starting. But the scale needed is massive. Otherwise, you're going to have the scenarios where 83% of CSOs are voluntary. They're not receiving systemic funding. And there's a little bit of funding at the side to say, well, let's keep the civil society calm so they don't get in the way of the real business. That's the wrong kind of thinking.
Yep. We are running up against the clock, and so I could talk to you all for hours and hours. I mean, there is so much more to discuss here, but I want to say a huge thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Hajar. Thank you, Ali, for sharing such rich insights into this. The three main sort of words I've written down at the end are connecting, scaling, and systematizing. And how do we make civil society really a strategic partner in this? As I said at the start, I have a report that tries to touch on some of that, and I would be delighted if you're interested, if you take a look on the CSIS website. If you don't want to read an 115-page report, then we also have an executive summary, there's an audio brief, we have one-page country fact sheets, and there's an Arabic translation which will be coming very soon as well. Just to say a few final words of thanks. Thank you to my CSIS colleagues, in particular, Marty Pimentel, my co-author, Ali Deberge. Thank you to my colleagues in AV, to Dinesh and to Dwayne. Thank you to you for viewing this. And also thank you to Baha Hariri, whose financial support for this has made this project possible and supported this work. So much more to discuss, but I hope that this is just the start of a bigger focus on capitalizing on the potential of civil society to drive environmental action and make societies more resilient in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you so much.